Okay. All right. Danny, how are you?
I'm good, Jamin. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You were in Armenia, is that right?
Yeah, I spent the last month in Yerevan, hunting down old Armenian computational devices and researching a data center. And
Okay.
also feeling a bit refreshed after the academic year. So I'm glad
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
back
yeah.
at home.
What do you normally do during your summers? Because it sounds like this was like vaguely like quote unquote work related
It's
as a professor. So
it's the curse. I turn all of my passions into my work. I think the summer's no different. I mean, I do get to catch up on my backlog of comics and playing games. I've been playing like absolutely useless games, like well, at least for my research, like Final Fantasy 16. I'm
okay,
almost done with, and it's like
okay,
checking off
okay.
the backlog.
They're reshowing Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within at Brain Dead Studios here in Los Angeles. I went to go see Jim Jarmusch's first film, and they showed a trailer for it. And I like whispered to my wife, I was like, "Oh my gosh, is this Final Fantasy? Is this Final Fantasy?" It's like the graphics have come like back around now, where like they're like retro as opposed to just being like Uncanny Valley. It's like, oh, that's kind of like the look that you're going for now.
Yeah,
So
no, that's the perfect timing to go back to that. I feel like
yeah, yeah.
once it bears its history, it's so much more interesting.
No, that is 100%. Yeah, it was like a weird addition to the series and all that fun stuff. Anyway, all right. Well, I'm here with Danny Snelson of UCLA, and this is the Killscreen podcast. Thank everybody for joining me today. We got a bunch of things to get through. You know, I mean, aside from vacation plans and, and all that fun stuff. Yeah, so you know, I think maybe to start, just you know, it was an interesting week for Killscreen. You know, just you know, interesting week for Killscreen. I'm experimenting with some new formats in terms of trying to get more like news stories out the door, which is really interesting. There's simply like too many things that I want to write about, and simply do not have time. Do not have time to do like a full fleshed thing. So we're adding that to the program today as a couple newsy, broadly construed, like in the last couple weeks. I want to get it more to like, here's things that have happened in the last like 2 weeks. And just for listeners, also as a reminder, we'll be playing some clips from an interview with Bennett Foddy a little bit later. You'll be able to listen to that full unedited conversation in your podcast feed if you're a member. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, maybe to start, let's go to the archive. Originally, we ran a piece, so it's called Game Type Capture the School from Brendan Keogh, who's a fellow academic game studies professor. Also runs a website called Critical Distance, and originally ran in Killscreen issue number 2, which was the back to school issue. This was Brendan's first piece for the magazine as an outside contributor. Just to give a little like context for the, you know, a little bit of context for the for the piece itself. The construction was like was interesting because it's sort of designed as a set of rules. The conceit is basically Brendan and his friends were playing they're planning to play Halo. The power goes out and they decide to kind of like step into a real world play space and kind of design into a real world play space and role play spaces with some of the photos from the issue, and actually try to design like some of the rules. They called it you know, set player rules. So it's a bit of like Halo capture the flag, and they move on. It's kind of like you know, there's a ceramic Jesus statue as you know, it's one of the map's landmarks. And one of the interesting details was that, you know, they as kids, you know, designed this, or adolescents, I guess, there's these tennis courts that carry three sports worth overlapping painted lines. So the group kind of improvises like a fourth game, Pac-Man tag, like over top of it. You know, Brendan started the whole piece, you know, as a actual rules screen, like the school needed its own setting menu before the game could start. So Dan, I was going to ask you, do you feel like putting the rules in writing, if you're like doing something like this, trying to turn a physical space into more of a play space, do you feel like putting the rules in writing first makes the space more like a game? Or do you think it just proves that like the space had rules the whole time and nobody had really said them out loud?
Yeah, I like that last twist on it, right? Like, of course, like all of our social spaces have rules and mores. It's just that we're so habituated to them that they become invisible. I think that's what's great about setting new rules for these spaces or recoding them is that one, it like highlights the fact that all these spaces already have rules. So there's this great moment in the piece, for example, where they realized they could run along some kind of like I don't know. I couldn't quite understand exactly what it was, but it seemed like some kind of ditch that's used for service that they were not allowed to use during the day. But the game rules kind of like opened up like new ways to explore the space. I loved this piece. I thought it was just
Yeah. Have you
really
ever done something like that? Like kind of taken an existing space and kind of like turned it into like some other kind of like play space?
Oh, I love making games. And I think that's why I teach is that I just have like a captive audience of 20 students that I can force rules upon and have them play with me. So,
Yeah, that's a good way to
when I
think
teach
about
my
it.
video game classes, we almost always have at least one IRL session. So whether we're like writing our own LARP, we actually did a great, when I was studying Final Fantasy VII, I had them do a Final Fantasy VII LARP where they were some students were NPCs and others were, heroes on the quest. And we kind of filmed it as a machinima.
Yeah.
But I think like, taking those kinds of spaces, especially so that for me, it's the university, but, this high school that are so over determined by certain kinds of rules of what's proper in academe, how buildings are supposed to be used. And then like taking those spaces and then making them like playful. I think both like, there's a kind of like liberatory, like, oh, we're out of the normal right now. But there's also a way in which I think that recodes uh, the academic space to be something that's more open and stranger and less, necessary. That all of the assets of this space could be rendered otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's such a good point. I mean, it's interesting, like looking at live action role play as because there's also this like division in live action role play between the American versions, which tend to be much more fantasy, like rules based, versus like the Nordic or European
Yeah.
tradition, which is much more open ended, much more improvisational, like in that way. I think with this piece, it this feels like something that frankly comes more. It felt like it came more out of the kind of like the American tradition of like role play, like creating something new, having a structure to the game. There's rules to the game and that kind of thing. But yeah, it is interesting to kind of see some of the differences in traditions in terms of like how people sort of approach these things. Yeah.
And I was thinking
Um,
approach as well. If I can just add, I mean, I think there's something about this piece that's so beautifully anticipates the academic books. Both the video game industry does not exist, which is about independent play beyond commerce, and my favorite of Brendan's works, a play of bodies, how we perceive video games. Just a beautiful, phenomenological approach to the embodiment of play. And here, like the way that he writes about him and his friends demonstrates that kind of co-attentiveness, that like deep embodied form of play. And so I always find it really fascinating to find these seeds that turn into these like larger projects. That's a decade after writing this piece, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll link to the article in the description. I'm going to continue publishing things from the back to school issue. We finished up all of issue one, and so that's available for members online. But we'll be going piece by piece. This was the lead article from that issue, so it was fun to like ultimately like, get that out there.
Oh, and can
All
I
right,
ask,
cool.
do you do that? Have you built game spaces for yourselves?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. It's been a funny thing with having a 4-year-old. She's constantly creating
Yeah.
like new games. I find that like expressive quality in making games on the fly. I think it's just like a personality thing. I probably have a harder time doing that. Like sort of like stepping outside of that. I've never really liked it's interesting. Social deception games kind of fit into that category.
Oh,
Mafia, werewolf,
yeah.
those kinds of things where you have to like embody a role, and there are kind of maybe more fluid improvisational rules. I think sometimes that's probably been harder for me to. I think frankly has just been like harder for me to be able to I've made peace with it. Like I'm okay with that. I can live with that. But at the same time, I don't know, for some reason it's just been harder for me to kind of like do. I don't have a good like reason why that might be. Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, just because we had this great piece by a great profile of a I believe that they're Uzbekistan, and they're living in Belgium now, named Nikita Jagudajev, who is an Uzbek choreographer. And they have this great series called Basically that they've been doing. Let me see if I can pull this up here. It's like this open play space, basically, like as a choreographer. Here, let me share my screen here. Okay. So this is this is the work, and it's this improvisational work, basically, where Nikita brings in these different actors and actresses into a space. They're all kind of set in high school, and then Nikita's designed these relationships between the different actors and actresses in the piece that have these like rules that exist in a book, but it's mostly playing through the intense dynamics of that sort of like pop up during high school, and they've been performing it over the last like 6 years. And so the reason I bring this up is because as a participant, when you come into the space, they ask you to kind of like interface with like the different actors and actresses, which I can play along, but I don't know, I just have always had like a hard time like being a participant like in that particular way. I don't know. Maybe I think it's just ultimately just like a personality thing.
That's so disciplinary specific too. And I think, feeds on our last conversation about, games that tap into these other traditions. We were thinking about art last time, but choreography is a rule-based art form, especially the more improvisational variants. I think that there's something really, I love this piece, and I love thinking about this in relationship to like an improvised Call of Duty as being choreographed instead of rule-based.
Right. Yeah, right. So that is an interesting way to think about it. It's like, there's an existing rule set. What might that look like if it was expressed over like an individual environment? I don't know. Maybe I would have an easier time an easier time with that. Yeah.
The more rules, the better. I find if I have like a ton of rules, then I can like easily follow them. But if it's like one or two scattered rules and I have too much freedom, I get completely paralyzed. Maybe I'm like you in that regard.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, let's move on here. I wrote a piece earlier this week, or it's an interview with Bennett Foddy. Bennett Foddy is a philosopher turned game designer, an Oxford undergrad who co-authored a still-cited paper on performance-enhancing drugs before leaving academia in 2007 to teach at the NYU Game Center. And over the last 20 years, Bennett has been really interested in the body and like how it moves. That started with a game called QWOP, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. Here, I can pull it up here. We can go through a couple of Bennett's games before jumping into the main course. So this is QWOP, which is it's a little interesting. It's basically you control each the thighs and the calves. That's basically it. So Bennett worked on that, and then there's another game. Here's a bunch of like Bennett's games. You can see they're all very bodily focused. Another one called GURP, where you play as a climber, can only control their arms. But probably the thing that broke him out into like the public consciousness was probably Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. I believe that game was like fairly successful. That was a pretty successful game with streamers in particular. But basically, that game you play as a person in a giant pot who again can only control their hands. Their most recent game, his most recent game, is a game called Baby Steps, which came out, I believe, last year. Baby Steps, really interesting conceptually. It follows a fail son, who is responsible. Basically, gets dropped into this world after basically their parents are really mad, and functionally they can only walk. That's like the only thing that you can do. It's just basically a game about like walking and space and that sort of thing. I had a great conversation with Bennett about this game. Baby Steps is interesting because it kind of places you in this big world. You can only kind of like walk and traverse through it, sort of like piece by piece. There's all these secrets for it. They've buried all these things. There's like birds that you can go after, and bells and hats and tiny. It's a really immense and textured place that that Bennett designed along with Gabe, Cuzzillo, and Maxi Boch. So I think maybe the start. What were your first initial? I'm sure what your experiences were with Baby Steps. Is also one of these games because of its like difficulty, which is like in the tradition of Bennett Foddy's games. Is also like one of these games that you could definitely You can watch other people. We can talk about that, but yeah, maybe Danny to start. How was if you played Baby Steps? Was this something that you had jumped into? What were some of your like initial impressions for this particular game?
I love this game so much. As I mentioned before, I was teaching an isekai course, and I think it was Rush Frushtick who was first writing about how Baby Steps is absolutely an isekai, where you're ported into this parallel world. And so I was teaching it this last spring and got to spend a lot of time playing it and thinking about it with my students. Like QWOP, I think that's important to say, like, the way that you end up, all you can do is walk, but walking is actually quite difficult, or at least it starts difficult and then it becomes kind of intuitive where you're using bumpers and the joysticks to control each of the feet. Um, so no, my first experience with this, and I maybe it's the literary scholar in me, so I can't help but like try to place it in a tradition. And there's something so Beckettian, like Samuel Beckett, about both this work and I think like a lot of Bennett Foddy's work works. Getting over it, the pot that the character's in. There's a famous play by Samuel Beckett where all the characters are in similar kinds of pots. So I've been kind of thinking about that in this like big empty wasteland. It's also like, like Beckett, it's like methodical, it's bleak, and it's also like hilariously funny at the same time. And the character seems to be struggling to do the most basic tasks, which
Right.
like Watt and some of like Beckett's like best characters have this like the struggle to do anything normal. I think again like reflects so beautifully on like what we presume to be normal or what we take for granted, like
Yeah.
mobility or modes of conversation. Or I think you covered this in your interview, like using your hands. Like, why is it that this character can't use their hands? Why is this like weirdo or this dork like just like unable or like unwilling to think about using his body the way that other people do?
Yeah, that was one of the things that was one of the I don't know if that made the yeah, I don't know if that exactly like made the cut in the interview. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but like one of the big developments I think for Bennett's games is he's gone from these games being purely mechanical and sort of having like a light like narrative layer. Sports is a really helpful shorthand, right? Sports can be really helpful because it grounds people in something that they probably already know, like you just sort of are familiar. And he says that about like that is one of the nice things about like working with the body is that as a game designer you're not trying to teach new systems. Players come in with expectations for how the body like should move even if they've never done the thing. That's a very as a designer you don't have to teach someone again like ostensibly how like walking or swinging a cricket bat or rock climbing. People sort of like have like shorthand for that. One of the interesting things that definitely came up during the conversation was how the kind of the narrative, the story so to speak, was something that grew out of a long period of experimentation. There's a lot of obviously back and forth whether you should start with story, you start with mechanics, and he does really seem like to have squared the circle just by having an elongated design period and coming up with this idea. Like once you start spending time with this character who's only walking, it's kind of like, well, why isn't he using his hands? And that offers like a whole set of like other questions about about Nate's unwillingness. In this case, it's like Nate is unwilling to ask for help, and that is kind of in a nutshell like what his problem is, so to speak. He will not ask anyone for help, which is very relatable. But that kind of grew out of the mechanics as opposed to them starting with like, oh, I want to do a game about this kind of yeah, I don't know, incel-esque fail son kind of character who, if you started with the story, maybe you would have ended up with like a different type of game. But the mechanics really, in this case, like really did drive the narrative components. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I loved how that came up. How there's so many games where the narrative is the sort of like starting point, and then you build mechanics to like achieve that narrative. And I think this working in the opposite direction, like starting with a mechanic and then letting that mechanic then generate this whole world around it that has to make sense of. Okay, like these like fundamental like design principles you covered, where it's like you like if you fall, like you really fall, like there are no checkpoints. If you see something, you can climb on it. So that you linked up to that Matthew Matosis video on aesthetic deception, which I thought was like a really useful way to think about this as well. Where like that there's nothing aesthetically deceptive about this environment. If you see something, you can try to walk on it. You won't quite know if the angle is just right, and it's going to make your weird body flop over. But I think that there's something really fascinating about starting with the mechanics and the principles of mechanics and then seeing what kind of world grows around them. And I think
Yeah.
you can feel that kind of like organic growth when you're playing Baby Steps.
I mean, the other thing that I like about Baby Steps as well is because so much of the game focuses on really understanding the mechanics of walking. For those who haven't played the game, you basically, the character basically lifts his, basically Nate lifts his left and his right foot, and then you can kind of like use the thumbsticks to sort of like adjust his balance. That's really and that's really about it. And so you're constantly kind of like picking up and replacing the step and trying to sort of assess the grade of a particular stone, or trying to get over a bridge or whatever it might be. And the big thing is like he has like almost no thigh strength. That's like the thing too. He like really does not have a great ability
Yeah.
to like he really does not have the ability to like, so going upstairs, for example, is something that ends up like being like very difficult for a character like Nate. One of the things I liked is the game is really a rejection of, I think, a maximalist tendency that we see in games, particularly as it relates to complexity. I talked with him a little bit, was reminded of this idea from the philosopher Michael Polanyi. He talks about the difference between like tacit and focal knowledge. And so like when you're learning to play the piano, for example, you just learn to play all of the individual keys, but as you become more of an expert. I'm finding this now, I'm like working on my Spanish, and I have to focus.
Uh-huh.
I'm at the stage now where like I have to focus on actively talking as opposed to trying to translate each individual word. And so we take for granted with certain types of skills that they all start with this kind of like focal knowledge. We focus on each individual keys, and then that becomes Tchaikovsky or whatever it might be. Bennett's approach is really interesting because I think he is demonstrating that there is like near infinite richness in very small micro interactions in a way that I think is really profound, and that you could take any kind of interaction of a digital body and a digital space, and if you work on it and you work on it, that in and of itself could be compelling. And that is like such a reminder about, for me, such an exciting reminder of how much games still have yet to do, right? It's just it's just walking, right? It is just a walking game, and it creates all this kinds of richness. And so before we take these like big, cognitive and narrative leaps about going to X place or Y place, it's like, it is possible to go very big. It is also very possible, and big systems games that do this, that try to simulate each individual piece. But you can also get incredibly, incredibly granular. I think that is something really beautiful, and you do see this in other mediums as well, where you have a great story that takes place like in a room, and you have a great story that is a grand epic that goes around the world, or there's lots of ways. Film does the same thing. You can have a great story that's inside of just a particular interaction of two characters like sitting at a table, and something that is Fast and Furious or whatever. So it's not an indictment that say like one type of game is better than another type of game, but it is this reminder of like games do really have this ability to go very, very small, and that can provide a tremendous amount of like richness in its like interaction systems. So that was one of the things that really jumped out at me.
Yeah, and I liked that the origin narrative about Bennett talking about how he learned games, which was just like playing like hundreds of Flash games, like eating up as many games as possible, and also that relationship to like piracy, or this earlier moment on the internet, where you just like encountered and gathered a lot of things rather than just sort of getting plugged into the same AAA environment. And I think there's something about that. If you're playing a bunch of tiny games all the time, like I know you are, for example, like every game teaches you its own rules. And I think that's one of the things that's like fundamental to games, is you don't know how the world is going to interact until you start interacting with it, unlike the pages of the book, for example. And I think that there's something about Bennett Foddy's games in particular that are so heavily oriented toward that aspect of games, like learning language, or when you first try to write something, you draw letters before you start to write them. So you have to like kind of like start from scratch. And it's really hard, I think, to get to that place where you're so defamiliarized, where we're so used to like opening up a game and then like, Assassin's Creed style, just like sprinting forward. And so like to like take these like things we take for granted and like force us to like painfully learn them again, but in a way that like makes that painful learning funny or pleasurable or comedic, I think is really just kind of a stroke of magic.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me. I have a couple clips from Bennett here from our interview together. One of the words that came up a bunch, you talked about, he's been playing a lot of games. He's kind of like he's sort of like an interesting character in that his story is both familiar, but also different. Like, he said growing up in Australia, and this is a common experience for people who grew up outside of Western Europe and the United States and Japan, is that their experience with games was often through these like, hacked cartridges, and you have hundreds of games. And so it builds this peripatetic, this kind of like itinerant point of view where you're constantly dipping into games. And whereas for me, I'm like, I get a game from Blockbuster, or I got to rent a game as a child. I'm like, I'm going to finish it or play it as much as humanly possible, because that is just what you have. He draws a direct line between that and the Flash game ecosystem, in the late 90s, early aughts, where you have thousands of, Flash designers making games, you kind of dip in and out. One of the things that came up a lot was like out of that experience, he talks about being like jaded. Is like he talked a lot about like jadedness, and he had this really funny story. About when he was a fellow at Oxford. When it needs to raise money, they sell off wine from the wine cellars, and so they would bring these wine bottles, particularly the whites, like out from the cellar, and they would place them in front of the fellows, and then let the fellows. They did this competition once to see like, let the senior fellows and the incoming fellows, which he was one, were junior fellows, let them judge the wine. And here's what he had to say about that.
So they brought out the wine cellar and laid out like 24 wines in a line, and everybody had to taste each one and kind of rank them. And I just remember there were a couple at the end which everybody had ranked either like 10 out of 10 or 1 out of 10. And it turned out like all of the junior fellows had written 1 out of 10, this tastes of gasoline. And all of the senior fellows had written 10 out of 10, wonderful notes of gasoline.
So he talks about that in the context of like games, right? Where he's like, he's at this plate now where he's like taste of gasoline. That's what he wants. He wants these things that like these games that will like shock the system. And so I was asking you, Danny, where do you feel like you fit on that like continuum of your like development as someone who plays games? Are you like gasoline is an abhorrent taste and no one should have it, or like, oh, gasoline perks up my senses, it's doing something interesting here?
Oh, I would like to think that I have a healthy amount of gasoline in my diet. I turn toward Baiju, and lately I've been thinking about experimenting with eau de vies, which are just like pure distillates. So, and I think in games is similar. I think it's about part of a diet though, right? Like I still love like my big AAA. I guess that would be the palatability of like $2 Chuck, like a AAA game that is intensely palatable. Where like I feel like having some gasoline. Like what I like about that example is that the gasoline came up after sampling 24 other bottles, and I think like the gasoline only like has that kind of potency or that kind of like shock effect if you also have like been tasting like overly sweet wines for too long, and then your tongue is like thirsting for something else. I don't know. What's that like for you? Like, I know that there's some people who are just like pure aesthetes who want like, I want only the gasoline. I want like only difficulty, like, sickos to get into like Mario Kaizo, for example. Like that's like maybe the most like gasoline fueled platformer.
I mean, I think a lot of times the conversation kind of revolves around like difficulty. And I think this is like an aesthetic question about like whether or not like is games main language is difficulty. Is that, and you can make an argument whether it is or not. But I think when we talk about sort of games that are like gasoline, we often think of them as being like difficult mechanically. I mean, I probably would like to expand the aperture, just because I do think this idea of games being difficult or abhorrent, it doesn't just have to be. I mean, it doesn't just have to be. I don't think it just has to be difficulty. I think there's other ways that games can be difficult. They're not necessarily like mechanically complex, but they can challenge you obviously like in some other ways. I don't necessarily know if that's true. Seeing an interview with Christopher Nolan, he was talking about his love of the Fast and Furious franchise, for example, which I also love. I'm a big fan of that franchise. And so I think you can kind of go in opposite directions where it's like some people are like, oh my gosh, the only thing I watch so many films. The only thing that gives me joy is like watching very, very, very specific genre that's like nearly unwatchable. And then some people go in the opposite end, which is like, honestly, so much of my consumption is work. And so I really want things that are going to be like really, really easy. So I think the fact that Bennett has moved in that direction for his free time, I think more speaks to the kind of like person he is and the kind of player he is. But I don't think it necessarily is a prerequisite for, I don't think it's a prerequisite, or it's a natural outgrowth of literacy. I don't think it has to be, you don't have to kind of like move in that direction. So yeah.
And I think so there's that the difficulty side, but I think there's also like something on the game developer side that was interesting that came up in your interview around what he calls good hands.
Yeah,
like,
I have that clip. I can play that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, here we go. We'll play that clip.
I mean, Jamin, this is actually something that I've recently been talking about with my game designer friends. I'm really interested in this problem, right? So this is what we call the problem of good hands. So you're talking about if I'm playing a game by a designer whose work I have previously loved and felt like was really thoughtful with my time and really rewarded putting in a lot of time, then I have some kind of reason to assume that their future work is like that. But also, even within the context of a single game, games have language for letting you know that they're not wasting your time, right?
Right, yeah.
We call this the feeling of being in good hands. It's like, it can be a level design flourish that is kind of compact and is delivered early on. It can be that there's polish everywhere, right? That's called being in good hands. I'm really kind of interested in this because that's something that I worry about as a designer. I worry about trying to do that as a designer, but it's something I'm kind of bored of as a player. And the games that I'm really loving lately are the ones where I can't tell if I'm in good hands, where they're not, they're not, because the more that I feel in good hands, the more I feel like I can probably predict what the experience is going to be like through the end. It's like, this person is a fan of Jonathan Blow's design thinking, and they've set up 4 different puzzle mechanics, and they're probably going to combine all of those in every possible way, and there'll be one puzzle per every implication of that system. And then when we've fully exhausted all the combinatorics of these systems, then the credits will roll, and that's what I'm in for, right? Like, this person knows how to do that. That's hard to do. That's like that kind of works, right? Takes an expert designer. But it's also like, I have this feeling like sometimes I'll pick something up on Steam that has like 3 reviews, and it's just like, it's not clear to me whether the designer knows what they're doing. And then, that being the case, I can't predict which way it's going to go. And maybe there'll just be something that's kind of absolutely glorious and beautiful, or maybe it will kind of fizzle. But either way, it's like I'm in uncharted territory, right? I feel like I'm on a voyage of discovery in a way that I'm not when I'm in good hands,
He talks about this concept of being in good hands. That he and some of his like game designer friends, for example, they talk about this concept of good hands. And good hands is a concept where it's like you step into like a game space and you want to know if you're familiar with the game designer, then you trust them to sort of like put you back into, they're going to take care of you. And that could be lots of different ways that gets expressed. That could be like a little design flourish. It could be like the polish for the game. It could be like a certain like narrative construction. It could be something that it could be something that like sort of walks you through the experience. But this idea, and he was using this example of saying that like, he wants games that he doesn't want to know if he's in good hands or not. So it's like you find like, because there's games everywhere now, he's like, he kind of likes the little unknowing of like, does this person actually know what they're doing? Because it is possible sometimes to like have games that are sort of extremely difficult, that it's like a complexity of output is not a reflection of complexity of process necessarily. And so sometimes you might end up with something that is very hard, that is designed by the hands of a master, and sometimes things are very hard. And it's like someone has no idea what they're doing. So that concept of good hands I thought was super interesting.
Yeah, it takes that concept of difficulty and puts it over on the production side, which is, part of what I was thinking about the wine, to stay with the wine metaphor, the liquor metaphor for a minute. Like, good hands, like having a vintner that's going to have like the right balance of complexity, or the, cocktail maker is going to like balance everything right. Versus like, somebody who's just like making moonshine at home, and like 9 times out of 10 it's awful. And then like
you can also buy moonshine now. I mean, that's like a thing that you can
one
do.
Time like the balance of like corn to yeast just right, and it's fucking incredible.
Yeah,
exactly. Unlike anything you've tasted. And I was thinking about that with these like unpredictable amateur games that are made. Like, every once in a while, if you're sampling all this like homebrew moonshine gasoline, like there's often like moments where like something extraordinary pops out. I feel like this happens in the classroom as well, where like all my students who are amateurs will have these like wild experiments they're approaching, and most of them are failures. I encourage them to be failures, but I think when you wade through a lot of that, like every once in a while, something like truly surprising that like someone with good hands would never consider, right? Like there's something like, about like an unpredictable amateur that might surface some kind of mechanic that like anyone who's well versed in game design would abhor, and with like that their like good hands training would keep them maybe from taking certain kinds of creative leaps.
Right. All right. Well, we have one more clip to play. I have one more clip I can play here. One of the things that came up was a desire for it was a conversation around like realism, like broadly construed. It was a conversation that he was having with Gabe Cuzzillo, who is his co-designer, which I thought was really interesting. Let me play that clip.
We had been talking about letting you reset back, and he just really didn't want to do that, right? He felt like if I fall off a cliff knowing I can warp back to get my progress back, then I haven't really fallen off a cliff. It's not real, right? It's like fake falling off a cliff. It's like I'm playing pretend. Whereas if I know I have to do the work to get back, it's real in a way that video game losses or whatever are generally not real, right? So this is the same sense of reality, I think, the same aesthetic reality that drives not wanting to have invisible walls keeping you off a particular mountain.
Yeah, so this conversation about like to what extent, a game like Baby Steps, he says that, there's certain things that are real. There's certain things that are real, like the sort of the physics, and he talks about like he likes games that don't sort of like cheat. He said there's a tendency sometimes with physics-based games that you want to sort of like cheat the design. You can feel like the game designer sort of like stepping in, kind of putting the bumper rails up just so you don't get like a little too far out over his skis. And this is a big sort of creative disagreement, I think, between him and Gabe about how to the extent to which it needs to be like real. And there's some things like, the ground is wet, but world doesn't get more slippery. Like there are some things that they sort of quote unquote cheat, but in general, they really tried to make the experience as quote unquote real. And that meant checkpoints as well. So it's like when you fall is like one of the sort of the remarkable things about the game. You can get quite far and then you lose your footing and you have to go like all the way back down to the bottom. I can regale you with certainly regale you with experiences. Certainly for streamers, it's just like someone gets somewhere and they fall off the mountain, they slide like all the way to the bottom. Yeah, tell me a little bit about your thinking in terms of like the extent to which something needs to be real in order to be like believable in that way, like in a game system.
Yeah, I think there's like a kind of rhetorical impact for that, like that use of the word real, right? Like obviously this is all like a kind of like simulated environment, and I think like from the very beginning when you crawl out of the pond like some kind of amoeba, you have to like figure out how the legs work, and like you're putting in a lot of labor, I think, as a player for a game like this to try to figure out what are the laws of physics, how do I move my body around, how do I interact with the world around me. And so I think that there's something rewarding that the game does if it keeps those laws really consistent. So like you're having a hard time just like taking a step, and so like I could imagine if like you're really struggling to take steps and you run into like, heaven forbid, an invisible wall, or like a bit of the terrain that's maybe like mapped inaccurately. I think that would throw the kind of trust you have in the work you've been putting in, like the real knowledge you've built around this world, it would throw it into doubt. And so I see that there's something really useful there. The giant falls are hilarious.
Itself, yeah.
It's like in a FromSoft game. I feel like the falls, like it felt to me like I was like going down one of those like dungeons or corridors where it's like something horrifying is going to jump out at me at any second. And I feel like that was how I felt about the falls. And so like even when I got confident with walking, I was so stressed that like, especially when you get close to an edge, like it just like it accelerates my like endorphins, like you're in this kind of like stressful situation. And I think if you didn't have like a real consequence, like knowing like, okay, if I miss one step, I'm going to lose the last like hour of progress I've made. I think that like it produces that emotion that I think would be really hard to get at if you had checkpoints or these other things that broke that world.
Yeah, it's a little paternalistic, I guess. Is one way to think about it. It's like you will learn to love this. So anyway. Well, you can read the whole interview with Bennett, and members can listen to the whole conversation. All right, moving on. We got a couple quick hit things just before we close out for today. The first is Gareth Martin, who was a writer for Killscreen many moons ago, has since turned to become a game designer, revealed Signet City. It's a first-person, quote-unquote, fungal punk RPG. It's in the same like universe as his other games, Citizen Sleeper, and it's set in this monochrome 1978, 1979 Britain during the winter of discontent. So we got a couple screenshots here of of the game. You can tell it shares like some of the same like kind of like visual notes, some of the same like visual notes as and actually I have like a little clip here as well. Tell me a little bit about like maybe you want to tell me a little bit about what your response is to a game like this. I know this type of like strong narrative RPG is like right up your alley. Danny, what were some of your first responses to the game?
I'm so excited to see this. I mean, the two Citizen Sleeper games are really like in my top 10 list. I love those games, and both of them inhabit what I think Gareth calls like the ruins of capitalism and like deep space. And there's something so compelling about that. So seeing this, I was immediately thinking like where you maybe might end up in this kind of like post-capitalist ruin in space in the distant future in the Citizen Sleeper games. There's something about like this specific moment in the 80s and like hyperinflation, the rise of postmodernism, the development of global capital at this like specific moment is like it's like a spore, or like it's like a seed point for like the kind of like unfettered capital that we've seen, I guess, over the last like 40, 50 years. So I'm really excited about like what I love about the Citizen Sleeper games was the politics, the care, the kind of the aesthetics, of course, but they just seem to bring so many things together in a way that felt to me very urgent and very capable of speaking to big questions about capital and politics. And so I think like immediately I was just like, I cannot wait to see how this plays out. And the all the materials that we have right now are very evocative, but to see, how some of those same themes will carry over to Signet City.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you play as a parasite. You're born in the brackish water of declining coastal city bay, and you're kind of moving between human minds. And it's in this world where there's like biological computing that's actually stronger than silicon chips. And so there's definitely there is definitely a bit of, it's interesting to kind of like maybe take some of the like cybernetic mechanics of like cyberpunk as like a genre and kind of like apply it in this like different way in terms of like using biology as a way to like hack other characters. And there's not like a ton of new like detail, not a ton of new detail, but it does seem like definitely an amalgamation and kind of like an interesting direction also, I think, for things that are in the quote unquote cyberpunk like that genre, but moving into like a different kind of like moving it into like a different space. And it's interesting that fungus is like this idea that your body gets taken over by a fungus is like obviously something derived like deeply from nature, obviously popularized with like The Last of Us or Planet Earth, David Attenborough. That was the first time I heard. I think maybe there's maybe like a Radiolab episode about some of these about these like funguses that take over ants and basically control their bodies. But this idea of like some other being getting inside your body through biomechanical means is interesting. Kind of taking some of those ideas where it's not just like you're hacking. It's like, oh, you're actually doing it in a biological way.
Yeah. And the aesthetics, I mean, these like the I was thinking about this in relationship to Brendan's essay as well, that this kind of like nostalgic photographs from like a distant time, 2011 or the 1980s. And it seems like the design style is really like fascinating. Like I know you mentioned, tracing over photographs. So this kind of like blending of like real captures and like a kind of like rotoscopic kind of tracing pattern. Feels like almost like another like a fungal infection on history itself or something, that like the game itself is kind of like reimagining and reconfiguring these kinds of historical documents.
Yeah. All right. Moving on, Danielle Brathwaite-Shirley, the incredibly prolific Danielle Brathwaite-Shirley.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle is a UK-based game designer and artist who had a show at the Serpentine called the Delusion. And Danielle released a new title. It was showed at the Delusion, but it's called I Didn't Realize You Thought You Were Like That. It's a free browser game. It's a Serpentine-backed standalone release where basically you're presented with a set of hostile online comments, and you have to make a decision about whether or not the person on the other side of this door, basically they come through this door, they present their comments, and you decide if you want to let them, basically you want to let them in, or you should basically like turn them away. It fits with some of the themes that Danielle is exploring in terms of like identity, but in this case it really focuses on online social interactions and a form of I guess a form of like gatekeeping, community management, kind of asking these big questions about like, what do you do? The game has this great line. It says like, there is no hope without fear. Like there needs to be something. It feels like it feels like a piece says, because it'd be simple just to sort of like reject everything that you disagree with, but it does challenge you to say like, well, what kind of community are you trying to build? And then at the end of the sequence, basically the different characters, there's a little sort of, they interact in a particular way. You get a little text readout of what's happened inside of your little community, and you get to sort of like sit with the nature of your decision. So it kind of puts you I guess it sort of like puts you in the mind of being like a Reddit mod or something like that. Anyway, it's a short game. A short game. We'll link to it in the show notes. Danny, any thoughts on Danielle's work? How you see this maybe fitting in with like some of the other work that Danielle has been doing at places like Serpentine? I've been really impressed with their career so far.
Yeah. All these games, I think that there's something really special about the way Danielle hails an audience or a player that really puts the focus on like, what are the decisions you're making? What are like the real politics or the real like stakes of making certain kinds of decisions that you might take for granted? And I love that they all live in the browser. Like I think that
Yeah. I played it on an iPad. It was great. Yeah.
It's amazing. And like, you know what? Like our little browsers are like game engines. And
yeah,
like,
I know. Totally.
Yeah. I think this, I know also think a little bit about Aidan, but Aidan and others, I think recently, I think a lot of young game designers are really trying to think about, okay, like we don't have to run in Unity. We don't have to run through the Steam store or even itch. Like a browser can be a game. You can produce game-like experiences that are profound and meaningful. And I think, whenever I teach Danielle's work, that's always the starting point. That like, look what you can do. Like, look at what kinds of interactions, just like clicking through, links and videos and like poorly encoded GIFs. Like, what kind of environment and what kind of real like meaningful ludic experience that can create.
I mean, the other thing is that Danielle's been interesting as an artist, making more of their games like publicly playable and available for the public. There are quite a few games that I see at exhibitions that just like they're either in development for a long period of time, but they're just not playable, and so all you can see is photos. And so I think Danielle has had a great ability to be able to present challenging work and get it out to the public and have it accessible to the public, which I think feels like obviously it's a deliberate choice on Danielle's part, but I think it's also pragmatically it really helps to ground what people, and it's a different experience. Obviously you play this in a gallery in front of other people and they can watch you make those decisions. That's going to be different than an experience where you play in front of in the comfort of your own home.
Yeah, it builds on that like activist premise of all of Danielle's work, where I think that the democratizing gesture of like having all these games freely available, so you don't have to be in the rarefied space of Serpentine to encounter them, perfectly rhymes with the real questions they're asking about gender, sexuality, and race. In all these games, where inside outside communities, filter bubbles, the rise of certain kinds of toxic online environments, like all of these things that like Danielle's games, that they all have like a kind of, they're very pointed activist works, and so I think like that like wide like democratic accessibility is such a boon to being able to get those messages across.
Yeah. All right. Well, the last little news item before we peace out. Aidan Strong is a resident at UCLA Game Lab and has released an amalgam, an amalgam MMO. I believe is a term that Aidan used. It's called TEXTURETOWN. Here, I can pull this up here. But TEXTURETOWN is super interesting. It's a mix. It's a bit of a new game wearing old skin. It's got a mix of Disney's Toontown Online running on the original source code. It's got different sensory channels from other dead MMOs, Club Penguin, sounds from Pirates of the Caribbean. It's got a little bit of textures from Cartoon Network's Fusion Fall. It's a world, I believe names were a world that resists understanding while remaining technically completely playable. I believe that was the language that Aidan used. Really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. I think like a concept, especially at a time that like we're not seeing a lot of like new MMOs. There was definitely like a window where they're like MMOs are the future, and you had World of Warcraft and like all of these like virtual environments really really started to take off. That is no longer the world that we live in. Although obviously many games are played online, the most popular games in the world. So that's the piece that's been pulled from MMOs is these like shared spaces. do you want to tell me a little bit about like what your experiences have been with Aidan? You know, obviously being at UCLA Game Lab, I'm sure you've seen this live, and yeah, tell me a little bit about like your experiences with Aidan. Maybe as I don't know if you had Aidan as a student, but it's definitely a game that I thought was interesting and made the cut. So
Yeah,
that was before, far in the background from the game, by the way, for anyone who's listening, just so you know.
Aidan is so wonderful. Yeah, I got to work with Aidan in my web writing workshop course. It was a kind of web revivalist, very rooted in this kind of aesthetic. So thinking about, you know, GeoCities and the 90s of the internet and how we can surface some of those like degraded digital cultural objects in the present and how they might be able to speak back to things like generative AI.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like I really see this work in some of that framework and also Aidan's larger practice, which has really been about like gathering the elements of digital making, whether they're like pixel forms that are raining down from the sky or texture maps or bits of code. I think that Aidan has this like really amazing way of bringing together otherwise discarded aspects of digital production and then making them saying something new. So this TextureTown is just so funny, and I think that the Meanderware format that Natalie Lawhead maybe has pioneered is a good framework for thinking about like I don't know how to move through this like insane space. You described it, I think, really beautifully, Jamin, as preservation practice as collage rather than restoration.
Yeah, right.
Great.
Yeah.
Like and in some ways, like yeah, you could preserve Club Penguin, but like I wouldn't be nearly as interested in that as I am in this. I think that there's like aspects of like defamiliarizing and grouping and amalgamating all of those different elements that again makes things strange. I mean, this game is fueled on gasoline, I think, Jamin.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good. I mean, we talk about games being difficult. I mean, this definitely fits as like, oh, this is difficult, but maybe in like in a different sort of way. I mean, the other thing is that interesting about these types of games is like, you know, MMOs occupy this like very unique space in that, you know, from a preservation standpoint, it's very difficult to preserve the social. And like, what makes these games work is the interactions between the individual players, and then you have this like detritus and trying to figure out like what to do with it because you can't recreate that moment in time. I mean, it is like they are performances in that way. I remember, you know, when I was working with Paolo Antonelli and their team on EVE Online, taking that into the Museum of Modern Art as part of the permanent collection, that was a huge presentational interpretive challenge for the museum, which was like, okay, you have this game that has like hundreds of thousands of users. How do we sort of display it, right? It's not like these other types of games that we're attempting to display. So what can we display? And so they settled on like a visualization of the interactions that CCP developed with a bunch of the players. And that felt like, you know, sort of a faithful recreation of what happens in this particular world. There is another way to do it, which is kind of like what Aidan's doing. Is like, oh, you just take the material and then you reconstitute it in some new way. And that is also, you know, is not, it does not necessarily like doesn't preserve it in the same way, but it does it's like an appreciation for it, I suppose. Like you create an appreciation for it, but it does have that unplayable nature. The look and feel of the thing that is unplayable, right? Like, and I think there's something kind of like neat about that for Aidan.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
I have way more I can say, but I don't want to take us over time on this.
Yeah. Well, that is it for this week. I hope you liked the new format. Yeah, we'll try and structure things going forward in this way. If you are interested, Danny, where can they find more of your work? Keep up with your musings on the internet.
I'm online. My name is easy to Google, but I also just launched a new website called thelittledatabase.com that extends out from my book, and I think it's got a playful, meandering design format. So I imagine listeners might find something interesting there. It gathers together a bunch of little collections of weird things that live on the internet.
Yeah. If you enjoy listening to this, please share it with your friends. Killscreen is active in many different ways. You can follow us on social. You can obviously like check out our podcast page. Killscreen.com has, you know, more updated things. And the newsletter is kind of like the centerpiece where it's a mix of things from the archive, a mix of news roundups of like games that you should know, as well as every Friday we do I do a playlist write up of one game each week that I would recommend. I know there's so many games out there, and the challenge is not like finding games; it's like knowing like what to play. And so there's something kind of nice about like a canon is kind of nice. It's reflective of certainly like my point of view. Danny, thank you so much. I really appreciate you making time, and I hope to see everybody very, very soon.
Bye.
Bye.